There comes a moment in the life of an empath when they find themselves entangled with someone who seems to both captivate and wound them. The connection feels magnetic, almost fated, as if destiny itself pulled them into the orbit of a person who shines so brightly at first glance. The narcissist enters like a storm and a sunrise all at once, flooding the empath's heart with attention, with admiration, with a kind of intoxicating focus that feels rare in a world where the empath has so often felt unseen. For the empath, who has given endlessly to others with little in return, this sudden wave of validation feels like water to a parched soul. It feels like home. But slowly, and often too subtly for the empath to notice at first, the warmth begins to cool. The bright admiration that once felt like sunlight starts to flicker like a candle in the wind. The praise that once lifted them becomes laced with criticism. The tenderness turns into silence. And the empath, with their deep capacity for love and understanding, starts to bend themselves into shapes that are not natural just to keep the peace. They apologize for things they did not do, they silence their needs in fear of losing what little connection remains, and they carry the heavy burden of believing that if they could just give more, love harder, be more patient, then the warmth would return. This is where the empath enters the cycle that defines relationships with narcissists. The beginning is the idealization phase, where the empath is placed on a pedestal and showered with affection. It feels like a dream, like a long-awaited answer to a lifetime of loneliness. But then comes the devaluation phase, where the pedestal crumbles, and the empath is met with criticism, blame, and emotional withdrawal. The ground beneath them feels unstable, as if love is always one mistake away from being lost. And eventually, there is the discard, whether in the form of distance, neglect, or outright abandonment, leaving the empath shattered, confused, and questioning their very worth. Carl Jung taught that what we repress in ourselves often returns through the people we are drawn to. The empath, raised to believe that selfishness is wrong and that selflessness is the only path to love, suppresses their own needs, desires, and boundaries. And then they meet the narcissist, who embodies everything they were forbidden to express. The narcissist is unapologetically self-centered, demanding, even entitled. To the empath's unconscious mind, this dynamic feels familiar. It echoes childhood lessons of conditional love, of needing to earn affection by giving endlessly, of silencing the self to keep someone else satisfied. And so the empath finds themselves pulled toward the very person who will reopen old wounds in order to force them to face what has been hidden. The relationship becomes a mirror. Every cruel silence, every act of manipulation, every shifting boundary reflects back to the empath the pain they have carried since childhood. The pain of feeling invisible. The pain of believing they must sacrifice themselves to be worthy of love. The pain of equating their value with how much they can give. This is why leaving a narcissist feels impossible for an empath at first. It is not only about the person in front of them. It is about the unresolved story of their past, the inner child still waiting for the day when love would finally arrive and stay. Yet within this painful bond lies a hidden gift. The narcissist, though destructive, forces the empath to confront the truth they have avoided for years. The truth that giving without boundaries is not love. The truth that sacrifice without recognition is not connection. The truth that love built on fear of abandonment is not love at all. Slowly, the empath begins to awaken. They begin to recognize the exhaustion in their body that no amount of rest can cure. They notice how their spirit feels heavy even in moments of calm. They realize that their reflection in the mirror looks dimmer than it once did, as though they have been fading from their own life. And with this awareness comes the first sparks of change. The empath, who once thought boundaries were cruel, begins to imagine saying no. The empath, who once thought their needs were a burden, begins to whisper those needs into the silence. The empath, who once thought they had to earn every drop of love, begins to question if love should ever feel this conditional. And though these are small acts at first, almost fragile in their newness, they carry immense power. Each time the empath honors themselves, even in the smallest way, they take back a piece of their soul that had been lost in the fog of manipulation. The narcissist senses this shift, and often, they resist it. They may grow angry, they may withdraw, They may attempt to pull the empath back into the cycle of control with charm or cruelty. But once the empath begins to awaken, something irreversible happens. The spell starts to break. The empath realizes that what they mistook for love was never love at all. It was need, it was control, it was the echo of old wounds dressed as passion. They see that no amount of giving will ever fill the void inside a narcissist, because that void was never theirs to heal. This realization is painful, but it is also the beginning of liberation. The empath learns that their empathy, their sensitivity, their ability to love deeply, are not flaws. They are gifts, but only when they are given consciously, with boundaries, with choice, not as tools of survival. They begin to understand that they do not need to rescue everyone, especially those who thrive on their sacrifice. They begin to see that their needs are not shameful, but sacred. And they begin to recognize that walking away from what drains them is not betrayal, but the ultimate act of self-respect. And in time, the empath transforms. What was once a cycle of depletion becomes a path of empowerment. What was once a wound becomes wisdom. They carry the lessons of the narcissistic bond, but they are no longer chained to it. They emerge stronger, clearer, and more whole, with an understanding that their empathy must begin at home. They learn to give to themselves first, so that what they offer the world is not rooted in exhaustion, but in fullness. They learn that love is not meant to be earned, but shared. They learn that being sensitive does not mean being powerless, and that saying no can be the most loving act of all. And so, the empath who once felt trapped in the cycle of a narcissist finally steps into their own freedom. They no longer seek validation from those who cannot give it. They no longer silence themselves to avoid conflict. They no longer mistake intensity for intimacy. Instead, they walk forward with quiet strength, carrying the truth that their worth is not determined by what they give away, but by who they are. And in this truth, they find peace. When an empath meets a narcissist, the story almost always begins the same way. The narcissist arrives like a sudden light, dazzling and consuming. They shower the empath with attention, with gestures, with words that feel almost supernatural, and how perfectly they match what the empath has always longed to hear. To someone who has spent their whole life giving, being seen in this way feels intoxicating. It feels like finally, after years of being misunderstood, someone understands. But what seems like destiny is only the first act of a performance. The narcissist is not truly seeing the empath. They are studying them, mirroring their dreams, repeating back the exact things that will make them feel bonded. This is the hook, the opening move in a cycle that is designed not to love, but to control. As weeks pass, the mask begins to slip. The words that once lifted the empath now cut them down. The affection that once felt steady now comes and goes, unpredictable and confusing. One day, the narcissist can be warm, generous, even tender. The next day, they can be cold, dismissive, cruel, as if the bond never existed. This instability is not random. It is part of the trap. The push and pull, the reward and punishment, trains the empath to keep chasing the version of the narcissist they met at the beginning, even though that version never truly existed. The empath, with their boundless compassion, does not walk away when the cruelty begins. Instead, they double down. They search for reasons, for explanations, for hidden pain inside the narcissist that might justify the hurt. They convince themselves that if they can just love harder, if they can be patient, if they can endure, they will bring back the warmth of the early days. But what they don't yet realize is that those early days were never love. They were bait. Every step the empath takes to give more only deepens the trap. The narcissist thrives on this cycle. Each act of forgiveness becomes permission to wound again. Each sacrifice becomes proof that they hold control. The empath begins to confuse devotion with survival, thinking that staying and suffering is the price of loyalty. And the narcissist reinforces this illusion by blaming them for every fracture, every fight, every silence. This is where the gaslighting begins. The narcissist twists reality, making the empath question their own memory, their own instincts, even their own emotions. A cruel remark is brushed off as a joke. A betrayal is turned back on the empath as paranoia. A clear wound is denied until the empath wonders if it ever happened at all. Bit by bit, the empath's trust in themselves is eroded, leaving them dependent on the very person who is destroying them. The empath does not realize that their greatest gift, their ability to feel deeply, has been weaponized against them. The narcissist takes their empathy, their patience, their longing to heal, and turns it into a leash. Every time the empath tries to pull away, guilt is pulled tighter. Every time the empath dares to imagine leaving, the narcissist reels them back in with moments of affection, tiny fragments of the old mask. These small crumbs of kindness keep the empath bound, hoping that maybe, if they endure a little longer, the love they believed in will return. But deep down, beneath the exhaustion and confusion, the empath begins to sense a quiet truth. They notice how little of themselves is left. They remember the person they used to be, full of laughter, full of energy, full of light. They see how far they have drifted from that person. The empath begins to feel the hollow weight of invisibility, the ache of being erased in a relationship that pretends to be love but is only control. The most painful part is the way this dynamic echoes their childhood. Many empaths were raised in families where their worth was tied to caretaking, where love was conditional, where their needs were overlooked. The narcissist awakens these old wounds, pressing on them with uncanny precision. The empath feels the same hunger for approval, the same ache to be accepted, the same fear that being selfish means being unworthy. And so they stay, even when staying breaks them. Time passes, and the cost grows heavier. Their health suffers. Their spirit feels dim. Their laughter is forced. Their friendships weaken as the narcissist isolates them further. The empath looks in the mirror and barely recognizes the tired eyes staring back. And yet they still cling to hope, because letting go feels like betrayal. They cannot see that the betrayal has already been happening all along, not to the narcissist, but to themselves. This is the heart of the trap. It convinces the empath that everything is their fault. That if only they were better, more loving, more forgiving, more patient, the pain would stop. But the pain is not a result of their shortcomings. The pain is the design of the relationship. The narcissist does not want healing. They want control. They do not crave intimacy. They crave power. And no amount of sacrifice can fill that hunger. And yet, even in this darkness, a spark survives inside the empath. A whisper of truth that refuses to be silenced. It tells them that something is wrong. It tells them that life is not meant to feel this empty. It tells them that their love should not come at the cost of their soul. This whisper is faint at first, but it grows louder with time, no matter how much the narcissist tries to drown it out. And it is this whisper, this fragile yet unbreakable voice within, that begins to mark the turning point. The trap is strong, but the spirit of the empath is stronger. The empath stays. They stay long after their spirit begins to whisper that something is wrong. They stay because walking away feels unbearable, because the thought of abandoning someone they love feels like committing a crime against their own heart. They stay because they were taught since childhood that love means sacrifice, that kindness means silence, that their worth is proven not by how loudly they speak but by how much pain they can endure without breaking. And so the empath does what they have always done. They endure. But enduring does not mean surviving. Enduring does not mean living. It means carrying the weight of two lives on shoulders that were never meant to bear so much. The empath apologizes when they have done nothing wrong. They forgive wounds that were never acknowledged. They bend until their back aches, until their very identity begins to twist under the pressure. And every time they give, the narcissist takes more. Every time they try to reclaim themselves, the narcissist punishes them with silence, with blame, with cruelty disguised as honesty. Inside, a war rages silently. On one side is guilt, whispering that leaving would make them selfish, unkind, unloving. On the other side is truth, faint but persistent, reminding them that something is deeply broken, that no amount of patience will heal what was never meant to be whole. This war exhausts the empath more than the narcissist's cruelty ever could. Because it is not just a battle against another person. It is a battle against their own conditioning, against the deep programming written in them as children, when they learned that their needs were dangerous, and that being loved meant disappearing. Every empath knows this war. It plays out in sleepless nights, lying awake while their chest feels heavy, while their mind replays every sharp word and twisted memory, trying to find proof that they are not imagining the pain. It plays out in the quiet moments, when they smile on the outside but feel hollow inside, when their laughter sounds foreign to their own ears. It plays out in their body, in the headaches, the tension, the fatigue that grows heavier with every passing day. The narcissist drains them, but it is the war within that nearly destroys them. What makes this war so brutal is the confusion. Because the narcissist is not cruel all the time. They are cruel just enough to wound, then kind just enough to keep hope alive. This is the cycle of intermittent reinforcement, a psychological trap that binds deeper than chains. The empath clings to the small crumbs of affection, the rare moments of tenderness, and tells themselves it means the love is still there. They convince themselves that if those moments can exist, then maybe everything can return to what it once was. But those moments are not love. They are control. They are proof that the narcissist knows exactly how to keep the leash tight without letting it snap. The empath, meanwhile, grows smaller. They stop speaking their truth because it only leads to arguments. They stop setting boundaries because every line they draw is crossed with anger or guilt. They stop asking for their needs to be met because their needs are always framed as burdens. And soon, they stop recognizing themselves altogether. The mirror reflects a tired face, a dimmed spirit, eyes that once sparkled but now look weary. And yet, even in this silence, they stay. Because staying feels safer than leaving. Because staying feels familiar. Because staying feels like the only story they were ever taught to live. This is the tragedy of the silent war. The empath is not only battling the narcissist. They are battling generations of conditioning. They are battling the child inside who was never allowed to be selfish, who was never allowed to say no, who was never allowed to take up space. They are battling a lifetime of believing that their value lies only in how much they give away. The narcissist becomes the latest chapter in a book that began long before the relationship ever started. And yet, buried in this war, there is something extraordinary. A spark that refuses to die. Even when the empath feels broken, even when they feel erased, even when they cannot imagine freedom, this spark endures. It is the part of them that remembers life before the narcissist. It is the memory of laughter that was real, of dreams that belonged to them, of a body that did not ache under the weight of constant stress. It is the soul's way of saying, I am still here. You have not lost me. This spark becomes the seed of resistance. The empath may not act on it yet. They may not even believe in it fully. But it begins to grow quietly. They start to notice patterns. They start to see that every cycle ends the same way. They begin to feel the injustice of their own silence. They begin to wonder if survival must always come at the cost of their joy. And slowly, very slowly, the war inside shifts. Guilt may still whisper, but truth grows louder. Fear may still weigh heavy, but freedom begins to call. The empath does not know it yet, but this inner shift is the first step toward breaking the cycle. The moment of awakening is not a single flash of light. It is not a sudden epiphany where everything becomes clear in an instant. For the empath, awakening is a long, almost painful unfolding, like a flower pushing its way through stone. For years, the empath has been told who they are by the narcissist. They have been told they are too emotional, too dramatic, too demanding, too fragile. And after hearing it long enough, they begin to believe it. That belief becomes the lens through which they see themselves. But deep inside, there is always a quiet voice whispering that something is wrong. At first, the empath silences it, afraid of what it might mean. Yet that voice never disappears. It waits, patient, until the day comes when the empath is ready to hear it. The awakening begins in small moments. A simple pause. A quiet realization. A feeling that they cannot quite ignore anymore. Maybe it happens when the empath is alone at night, replaying yet another argument in their mind, and suddenly they notice the pattern. They realize that no matter what they do, the narcissist always finds fault. No matter how they adjust themselves, bend themselves, diminish themselves, it is never enough. And in that moment, the first spark of truth is lit. The problem is not them. This truth is unbearable at first. It collides with everything the empath has been told. For so long, they have carried the belief that if they just loved harder, if they just forgave quicker, if they just gave more, things would finally get better. To let go of that belief feels like betrayal. Betrayal of their love, betrayal of the person they thought the narcissist could be. The empath grieves, not just for the relationship, but for the dream of what it was supposed to be. They grieve for the years they spent fighting for something that never truly existed. This grief is heavy, but it also begins to cleanse. Like a storm that washes the dirt from the air, grief strips away illusions. And with every tear, the empath begins to see more clearly. They see how the narcissist's cruelty was never about them. They see how their kindness was turned against them, how their sensitivity was labeled weakness, how their devotion was twisted into submission. And suddenly, for the first time in years, they feel something stir in their chest. It is not anger. It is not bitterness. It is strength. The empath begins to experiment with this strength, though cautiously. At first, it looks like tiny acts of defiance. Saying no to a demand. Refusing to explain themselves for the 100th time. Choosing silence instead of feeding another pointless argument. These acts are small, but to the empath, they feel revolutionary. Every time they stand firm, even in the smallest way, they feel a flicker of power returning. But with this flicker comes fear. The narcissist has trained them to believe that boundaries are punishable, that independence is dangerous, that selfhood is selfish. And so, when the empath begins to reclaim themselves, the narcissist reacts with fury. Rage, manipulation, guilt trips, the weapons come out in full force. The empath feels the pull of old patterns. They feel the guilt, the shame, the temptation to fall back into silence. Yet something has changed. This time, the empath sees the cycle for what it is. This time, they are not blind. Awakening is messy. It does not happen in a straight line. Some days, the empath feels unshakable, alive with the clarity of truth. Other days, they collapse back into self-doubt, wondering if they are cruel, if they are wrong, if they are ungrateful. Healing is not neat. It is jagged, uneven, filled with setbacks. But even in the setbacks, something irreversible has occurred. The empath can no longer fully return to the cage they once lived in. Once you see the bars, you cannot pretend they are not there. As the empath continues this journey, they begin to reflect not only on the relationship but on their entire life. They see how long they have been carrying roles that were never theirs to carry. They remember childhood moments when they were praised for being quiet, for being helpful, for never asking for too much. They see how they were taught to put everyone else first, how their identity was built around being the caretaker, the healer, the peacekeeper. And as they connect these dots, something even deeper awakens. They realize that their entanglement with the narcissist was not random. It was the inevitable result of wounds that had never been acknowledged. This realization is painful, but it is also liberating. Because it means the empath was never weak. They were never foolish. They were responding to old training, old survival strategies. And now, with awareness, they can begin to rewrite those patterns. They can begin to imagine a different way of being. The empath starts to envision a life beyond the narcissist's grip. At first, the vision is blurry, fragile. They imagine friendships where they are not walking on eggshells. They imagine love that does not drain them. They imagine mornings without dread, nights without tears. And though these images feel distant, they give the empath something they have not had in years: hope. Hope is dangerous to the narcissist. They can feel it slipping out of their control. They sense the change, even if they cannot name it. And so they fight harder. They make promises they will never keep. They stage dramatic apologies. They paint themselves as the victim. Anything to reel the empath back in. But the empath has tasted truth, and once tasted, it cannot be forgotten. The empath may stumble, may falter, may even return temporarily, but the trajectory has shifted. The flame inside them grows brighter with every small act of resistance. The silent war is changing. The empath is no longer only surviving. They are beginning to fight for themselves. They are beginning to reclaim the self they were forced to abandon long ago. And in this fight, something extraordinary is happening. The empath is transforming. They are not just walking away from the narcissist. They are walking back to themselves. This is the awakening, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. A slow and steady reclaiming of power, of voice, of life. And though the battle is far from over, the empath has crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. They are no longer the same. They are beginning to rise. After years of living in a shadow, after months or even decades of bending, giving, forgiving, and caring more than any human should, the empath begins to step into a new world. One where they are no longer defined by someone else's control. The awakening that began quietly in small pauses and subtle realizations now becomes a full tide, sweeping through every corner of their life. Every thought, every breath, every movement carries the knowledge that they are no longer the person who needed to earn someone else's approval to feel worthy. The first steps of freedom are tentative. The empath may still fear the weight of guilt. They may still hear the echoes of old conditioning, the voice that says they are selfish, that love means sacrifice, that their worth lies in giving themselves away. Yet even as these voices whisper, they feel weaker than the fire that has begun to burn inside. For the first time, the empath begins to act not out of fear, not out of hope that the narcissist will change, but because they themselves matter. Their boundaries become sacred. Their time becomes precious. Their energy, once drained endlessly, begins to be guarded, nurtured, and directed toward what truly sustains them. Breaking free is not only leaving the narcissist physically. It is leaving the mindset that has dominated them for so long. It is reclaiming every fragment of self that was chipped away in the constant cycle of control and manipulation. The empath begins to speak their truth, not to please, not to placate, not to earn love, but because they have a right to be heard. They begin to dream again, allowing themselves desires that were long buried, pleasures that were dismissed as selfish, ambitions that were silenced by years of overgiving. Every choice to honor themselves is a small revolution, each one building the fortress of their freedom. The narcissist may attempt to pull them back with promises, apologies, anger, or manipulation, but the empath no longer walks blind. They see the tactics for what they are. They recognize the bait, the illusion, the attempt to reclaim control. And this recognition, once absent, becomes their greatest weapon. They no longer doubt themselves, because they have spent long enough losing themselves to know the truth. Their heart is still deep and expansive, but it is no longer a lever for someone else's power. It is a source of strength, clarity, and unshakable self-respect. The healing process is gradual. There are moments of grief that come unexpectedly. Memories of betrayal sting sharply, old wounds reopen, and there are days when the empath feels the familiar pull to shrink, to vanish, to please again. But these moments do not last. With each return, they remember the lessons learned. They remember the fire that woke in the silent war inside. They remember that they have the right to their own life, their own joy, their own peace. And each remembrance strengthens them, reinforces the boundaries they set, and solidifies the self they are reclaiming. Over time, the empath begins to reconnect with the world in ways that feel new and radiant. They nurture friendships that honor their emotions, they build relationships that are reciprocal, and they find joy in activities and passions that belong solely to them. They realize that life can be rich, fulfilling, and safe, and that love does not have to be entangled with control or pain. The lessons of the narcissist are not forgotten, but they are transformed. What once caused suffering now serves as wisdom, as a guide for identifying toxicity, as a compass for what true love and connection look like. The empath also begins to understand the deeper philosophy behind their journey. They see that their empathy is not a curse, nor is it a weakness. It is a gift that requires discernment, boundaries, and self-knowledge to use wisely. They realize that they cannot save those who refuse to be saved, and that to try is not heroism but self-erasure. Carl Jung's insights on individuation and shadow work resonate deeply. The empath learns that they must embrace every part of themselves, the giving, the sensitive, the wounded, and the strong, to achieve wholeness. They learn that the final stage of empathy is not endless giving, but conscious giving that is aligned with self-respect and authenticity. In this stage, the empath finally allows themselves to rest. They do not apologize for taking up space. They do not fear being too much or too intense. They feel the freedom of self-possession, the calm of knowing their worth is inherent, not granted. And in this freedom, they discover something extraordinary, the ability to love without losing themselves, to connect without being consumed, to give without being drained. Their heart, once a vessel for manipulation and control, is now a source of joy, clarity, and unconditional yet wise love. The final phase is transformative, not just in the external sense, but in the very core of being. The empath stands taller, not in pride or arrogance, but in self-possession and groundedness. They carry the scars of what they endured, but the scars no longer define them. They carry wisdom where there was once naivety, boundaries where there was once endless giving, and a radiant selfhood where there was once only fear and doubt. They have walked through fire and emerged whole. And in the quiet of the night, when they are alone with their thoughts, they can finally smile without guilt. They can feel peace without apology. They can hear the whisper that first began the awakening and recognize it as truth. They are enough, they are worthy, and they are free. They are the author of their own life, no longer a character in someone else's story. And that, above all, is the ultimate triumph. The empath has survived, not because they were soft, but because they are strong. Not because they were naive, but because they are wise. Not because they gave endlessly, but because they finally learned how to give to themselves. And in this final, radiant stage, they are more alive, more powerful, and more whole than they ever imagined possible. The journey does not end here, but the chains have fallen. The empath walks forward carrying not only their heart, but the knowledge that they will never again surrender it to someone unworthy. And for the first time in a lifetime, they feel the quiet, unshakable, infinite peace of being fully themselves.